Hello, fellow Bethel people, and any others who follow us on our website. Welcome to this presentation. We want to give you some information about a project we've been working on for some time and talk about and tell you a little bit about this project that leadership has been working on for the past 2 years. We want to tell you about our church forming a society, and as part of that, developing a new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. We'd like to explain to you the whys and the wherefores in the process, and this process is going to go on over a period of about 3 months, and we'll be providing you with all the dates and times. We want to ensure that all of our fellow followers at Bethel are given an opportunity to be involved, and we're going to work very hard at trying to do that throughout the process. We're going to lead off on September 13th and 20th with a congregational meeting after the service. There will be subsequent congregational meetings after September 13th and 20th, and we'll tell you what those times are. So at that meeting on the 13th and 20th, we simply introduce the project and give you a good idea of what it's all about. So what we're going to be talking about is 2 proposals that are going to be considered in November. The first one is to form a society, and in order to do that, we must prepare and adopt a new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. And I'm using the initials CBG as a shorthand reference to constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. Okay, so why do we think we need to form a society? Well, the primary reason is that currently, because we're not a society, the members in our church can be held legally liable for liability claims that might ever be made against the church. So they're vulnerable. Legally, members are vulnerable in this church, and we consider that to be an untenable situation. And it's a risk that we don't think our members should have to bear. And we can avoid that risk by forming a society. And as a society, the members are not legal. Now, we received legal advice around this and have been advised that it would be prudent for us to form a society. As well, the Canadian Council of Christian Charities also advised that this would be prudent. On top of that, many of our members feel very strongly about taking this step. It's also a step towards us taking greater responsibility for the life of Bethel. And our church has changed significantly over the last 20 years, and we believe that our constitution, bylaws, and guidelines need to be updated accordingly. I want to make something very clear, and that is forming a society is not about changing our relationship with BC. That is a separate issue, and forming the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines and forming the society is not about changing our relationship with MCBC. And apparently, we were incorporated and operated as a society back in the 1990s. And in the late 1990s, we let our legal status lapse. I'm not sure why. Okay, as I say, to form a society, we need a new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. Extensive work has been done by this over the past 2 years with significant vetting and input from leadership, from all of leadership. We have also, of course, received legal input. And in terms of next steps, we're considering 3 rounds of congregational meetings. So round 1, which would be on September 13th and 20th, we propose and discuss the whole set of issues and the process and what it's all about. So it'll be somewhat of a repeat of what you're hearing now. And after those meetings, we will be sending out the summary documents to you. The second round of congregational meetings envisioned for September 27th and October 4th will be an opportunity for us to talk with you about, talk more about in detail about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and the timing and such. And we'll be very much wanting to hear your feedback, get your input, and get your views and opinions on the issues, and wanting to have a good discussion with the congregation in that round 2 meeting. And after that feedback session, we will be making revisions, if necessary, to the documents. The 3rd round of congregational meetings, which we envision for November the 8th and the 15th, will be an opportunity to further discuss the proposals and to finally vote on the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. And to get approval of that, we need a 2/3 majority vote. And assuming that does pass, hoping that it does, the documents will then be sent off to Victoria, and because they have to have approval over there, and we will also at some point in the future apply to MCBC to get title to our property back. One of the things we've done work-wise is to do a comparison of the old and the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. So the new documents consist of a constitution, which is a very short document of about 10 lines, 1 page, not even a complete page. And then there's the bylaws, and then there are the guidelines. And I'll explain more about those a little later. The old constitution consists of a constitution, which is about a 8 or 9 page document, and then a set of guidelines, which is another 8 or 9 pages of material. So what we've done is we've taken the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines and compared it with the old, and looking at all the important provisions. And we've summarized those, and we will be going over those with you at some point. But I'm not going to go through all of them now. We've looked at about 21 provisions, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. But let me begin by saying that most of the provisions that were in the old constitution and bylaw and guidelines are also in the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. So much of what's in the old has been carried over to the new. For example, membership of people wanting to join the church is affirmed by the congregation in the old guidelines. It's also provided for in the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. So that's one example. I'll just give you a couple more. Selection of the lead pastor. In the old guidelines, there's a requirement that come to the congregation, and we receive 75% approval. In the new constitution and bylaws, same thing. We have to have congregational approval for selection of a lead pastors. One other example is approval of the annual budget. That's required in the old guidelines, but it's also required in the new bylaws and guidelines. So just some examples. As I say, there are about 21 provisions we've looked at. There are some differences, and I will talk about those in a moment or so. So those various provisions, we will be going through those with you, and we will be providing you with a list of the comparison of the new and the old. Okay, I mentioned there's a couple of differences. There aren't many. One of them is the business of termination of a pastor, and that's always a sensitive topic, and you may be wondering, well, why are we considering that would be a board decision rather than a congregational decision? You may wonder about why we are proposing that it only be a board decision. And by the way, under the new bylaws, it would require 75% approval of the board. So why is it a board decision? Under today's employment climate, taking the decision to terminate a pastor to the congregation could compromise our legal position as an employer. In today's employment world and climate, that is a real risk, and we would not want to be taking on that risk. Secondly, the business of termination of a pastor can be very divisive, not to mention messy and disruptive. And our lawyer has advised against taking a termination to the congregation. The third reason is that we know that a pastor would not want this decision to go to the congregation, because knowing that he or she had lost the confidence of leadership, they are very unlikely to want to have it go to the congregation. They would most likely say, I'm going to leave before it goes to the congregation. So the pastor would not want this decision to go to the congregation. And finally, the congregation is involved in the pastoral evaluation every 3 years. That is provided for in the new bylaws. So the congregation will always have input into the performance of the pastor. And of course, the leadership quite often gets commentary throughout the year, every year, about the performance of the pastor. And we would continue to want to receive that kind of input from the congregation. One other area where there's a difference, and this is not a super high-level issue. Under the old guidelines, professional development for the lead pastor has to be approved by the congregation. Under the new bylaws, we're proposing that would be a board decision, because it is basically a routine administrative matter, and secondly, because sometimes quick decisions are needed. And that's been happening with Pastor John in the last several months. He's asked for a day here or a day there to do something, and leadership has made the decision to say yes. So we think that should be a board decision. Another very slight difference is with regards to cancellation of a membership. We're proposing that under the new bylaws, that would be a board decision. Now, under the old guidelines, it talks about it being a decision of ministerial council, and that it would go to the congregation if deemed necessary. When I read that provision in the old guidelines, my understanding is that the ministerial could make that decision right now without going to the congregation. But of course, they have the option of bringing it to the congregation. In our new constitution and bylaws and guidelines, this is a board decision, and of course, the congregation would be advised of any membership cancellations. So those are just three differences, and those are the key ones, and we can talk about those a lot more with you, and we want to get your feedback on those. I just want to make a comment about board trust. The congregation needs to feel that they can trust the board of directors, and of course, that trust has to be earned. And by the way, the board of directors, we're going to also be referring to them as the board of elders. I'll speak to that further in a moment. So the congregation needs to feel they can trust the board, and we also believe that the congregation will know who the board members are, and know them very well, I'm sure, because most of the people in leadership have been with our church for many years. And I would think they should feel that they can trust the board of elders. And as well, there's a provision in the new bylaws for a board member, or even the entire board, to be removed by the congregation by call of a special meeting. So if the congregation is unhappy with a board member or an elder or the whole board, they have a mechanism to rectify that and devote a board member or the whole board out of office. So that provision is there in the new bylaws. Now, I want to touch on some important provisions of the new Constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. Some of the key provisions. Firstly, there's a provision for adherence, and we've sometimes talked to you in terms of calling those people associates. These are people who have accepted Jesus as Lord and Savior. They regularly attend services, but they have not joined us as a member. So these adherents, there's a provision that they can join committees, but they cannot chair them. And they can vote on the committees, because we felt that if they're interested enough in contributing and sharing their gifts on a committee, they should have a voice on the committee. So they are allowed to vote on the committee. But they cannot chair them. Now, amendments to the Constitution. As I mentioned a few moments ago, our new Constitution is only about 10 lines long. It's about on a top third of a page. And amendments to that Constitution require 100% approval. Amendments to our bylaws require 75% approval. Under the old guidelines, amendments, or the Constitution, under the old Constitution, amendments to the Constitution require a 2/3 majority vote. So there's a difference there, but there's certainly safeguards in terms of the requirements of 100% to change the Constitution and 75% to change the bylaws. The confession of faith is a part of our bylaws. Baptism implies membership in our new bylaws. I've talked about the board being able to discipline or terminate pastors. That's in the new bylaws. There's a provision, too, for members to call a special general meeting for special members if they so wish. And the example I gave a few moments ago was that if they want to remove a board member, they can call a special general meeting. Only active members can be elders on the board, and the vision is that the elders on the board would fulfill the biblical role of an elder. That's an important thing to keep in mind. And at congregational meetings, only members can vote. So that's a provision in the new bylaws as well. In terms of the makeup of the board, we envision a smaller board compared with our church council, our current church council, and our current membership in executive and ministerial. And both of those bodies currently have about 10 people on them, 10 or 11 people. The vision for the new board is that it would be smaller, and it would consist of a chair, a vice chair, the chair of the deacons committee, and the chair of the finance committee, plus 2 to 3 members at large, or congregational members, people from within the congregation. So that would provide a board of 6 to 7 people versus the current 10 or 11 which we have in place now. As well, on the board, the lead pastor would be an ex officio member of the board, that means he or she would be non-voting. And we feel that a smaller board can be more effective, and it reflects our smaller church size. The nominations committee is also defined in the new bylaws, and the nominations committee would consist of the board chair, an elder, and one member at large from within the congregation, or one congregational member. So the nominations committee would consist of 3 individuals. Continuing on with some important provisions of the new Constitution, bylaws, and guidelines, there's a requirement that the board must meet a minimum of 4 times in the year. The term for an elder is 3 years, and an elder can run for 2 terms, so a maximum of 6 years, after which they have to take a year off if they want to consider running again to be an elder. There's a provision that all committees are accountable to the board. There's a provision that the deacons committee would include the lead pastor who can vote on that committee. We believe that would be a good thing to have on the deacons committee. The deacons, in terms of the process for selection, they must be members. They are nominated by the congregation. They're selected by the deacons and lead pastor. They are affirmed by the board and before election by the congregation. So right now, deacons are not elected by the congregation, they're affirmed. We're proposing that they be elected by the congregation in the new structure. The process for selection of elders is very similar, almost identical. Borrowing. In our old guidelines, it requires 75% approval, and under the new bylaws, same thing. We require 75% approval from the congregation. In the new bylaws, there's also a dispute resolution process that has been defined and laid out. Within the guidelines of the new documents, the duties of the lead pastor and other pastoral staff are defined. The ordinances and practices are defined, and these are practices and ordinances around baptism, marriage, communion, funerals, dedications, consecration of workers. These are defined. The duties of the elders, or the board members, are also defined. The guidelines also define the general guidelines for all committees, and there are 7 committees that we would have: finance, facility management, education, missions, outreach, worship, and deacons. And as well, in the new guidelines, sabbatical leave guidelines are discussed and defined. There is one new policy area which we have put into the guidelines, and it's something new, and we're recommending that we consider this. And that new policy revolves around the budget revisions. And there's 2 suggestions that are being made here. Firstly, subject to approval by the board, total expenditures may be exceeded by up to 5% of the approved annual budget. The congregation is to be advised of this, and expenditure increases beyond 5% of the total expenditures requires congregational approval. So the idea around having this new policy area laid out is it gives the finance board and the board of the finance committee and the board of elders some flexibility in dealing with unforeseen things that may arise. And that does happen quite regularly. There are things that come up and have to be done. And we may not have envisioned them in the original drafting of the original budget, but it's something that has to be dealt with. And I guess maybe an example that comes to mind is the fence on the west side of our property had to be rebuilt and set up because we wanted good relations with our neighbor. And it was not in the budget, but we decided we had to do it and get it done during the summer. So that's just an example of the type of thing that we think we require budget flexibility around. In that case, it was less than 5%, but I'm just using that as an example. The second provision around the budget is that it's to do with the contingency fund, and it talks about subject to approval by the board. The contingency fund can be used for unforeseen or special purposes. That's nothing new. Major expenditures from the contingency fund over $5,000 are required to be reported to the congregation before the expenditure when possible. In certain circumstances where there is urgency to the project or purpose, the expenditure can be reported after the fact. So what we're trying to deal with here again is unforeseen items that come up. We may get a leak in the roof that requires an expenditure of beyond $5,000. Or we might have a boiler that blows and requires repair. That could be easily more than $5,000. So these types of things are thought about in the drafting of this new policy around budgets. So something for you to consider as we go forward and talk about our new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. Let me talk for a little bit about our committees. We have the 7 committees, which I've listed, and a few points to clarify around those. The chair of the Deacons Committee and the chair of the Finance Committee are on the board. And we are thinking that other committee representatives may want to focus on their committee work and not attend a lot of meetings. So that's why we thought that only 2 out of the 7 committee chairs would be on the board. We want the committee reps to feel they can focus on their work. If other committee people wish to join the board, they can run as one of the congregational representatives. And an important point to note here is that the Board of Elders, Board of Directors, is going to work very hard at keeping committees up to speed and will be inviting committee people or whole committees to elder meetings from time to time. So the committees are going to continue to be valued and heard from as we work together in the church. I just want to say too, with regards to the whole business of a new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines, throughout our work, a key objective for us has been to have the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines serve the congregation, not the other way around. The new structure and documents and constitution and bylaws and guidelines are to serve the congregation while reflecting changes within our congregation. Okay, so that's a summary of what is envisioned going forward and what we would like to discuss further with you in our various upcoming meetings, starting on September 13th and 20th. We've also considered transition. So if this new formation of a society and the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines are approved by the congregation, how do we transition into the new structure and new process? So after approval by the congregation, we thought that it would make sense for the Board of Elders to consist of the following people. The current chair until March 2022, which is the time when the term would normally come up. The current vice chair until March of 2023. The current chair of the Finance Committee until March 2023. The current chair of Ministerial, the head deacon that is, until March of 2022. And the lead pastor. And finally, 2 to 3 elected elders to be elected before March 15th, 2021 at our annual general meeting. And the reason for these different times is because on the Board of Elders, Board of Directors, we want to have staggered terms so that we don't want 4 or 5 elders leaving the board all at once. We would like to have a situation where 2 leave 1 year, 2 leave the next year, 2 leave the 3rd year. Okay, so that's why we're staggering the dates. And as part of the transition, the committees that we currently have in place, they would continue their work. And by the way, we're saying committees, currently we refer to them as boards, but we would change that name and call them committees. So they would continue with their work. So that's the transition process we envision. And so that pretty well sums things up for now. We're going to have a lot more discussions with you and with the congregation in the 3 rounds that I talked about at the beginning. And the 3rd round is where we would consider the motions and vote on them. And the 3rd round of discussions would happen on November the 8th and the 15th. You may be wondering why we're providing two sets of dates for each round, September 13th to 20th. And for November, for example, November the 8th and the 15th. That's because, as you know, we've got 2 groups attending our services on Sundays, a Group A and a Group B. So we want to make sure we connect and hear from each of the groups and as many people within the congregation as possible. So on November the 8th and the 15th, there will be 3 motions that we will put before you. The first one is that the congregation support the formation of a society as envisioned. The second motion would be that the congregation support draft number 10, version 5 of the new Constitution, bylaws, and guidelines as presented. And the third motion for consideration would be that the transition process be implemented as presented, which I just talked about. Now, in terms of voting at the November 8th and 15th meetings, we require a quorum of 1/3 of our membership. We have 92 members in our congregation, so we would require 31 members to be involved in voting. Now, having said that, I just want to make clear we're hoping for much greater involvement than 31. We want to hear from all our members and get input from all of them. And as I say, we're going to work hard at getting that input. We're going to have 2 meetings, one on the 8th, November the 8th, one on the 15th. We're also going to look at digital voting to get input from people who don't want to attend or can't attend on a Sunday. So yes, we definitely want to hear from more than 31 members. We would like to hear from all of our members on this important project. And as I said earlier, the vote requirement to pass or amend our current constitution is 2/3 of those who vote. Okay? So, yeah, that's the current requirement in our current constitution. On September the 13th and the 20th, there is one motion we are going to ask for approval on, and it's to facilitate maximum involvement of our congregation. And we want to provide the opportunity for them to vote digitally. So we are going to ask on the 13th and 20th of September for the congregants to adopt the following motion: that the congregation approve digital voting on the formation of a society and the new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines when we take a vote on acceptance of the motions to be proposed later this year. So we're setting ourselves up to be able to accept digital votes in November. Okay, so that's what that motion is about. And so we're going to ask that that be approved on the September 13th and 20th. So yeah, we're looking forward to continuing discussions with you, with all of our congregants and our members and followers, and we're hoping that everybody will get involved and be willing to participate in our process here. I will also say that throughout this whole process, if you have questions about what we're doing, why we're doing it, the process, the timing, concerns you might have, please let leadership know, okay? We want to hear from you. Let me know. Call me, phone me, email me. I would be happy to hear from you because we want to hear from you. There are many others in leadership who have been involved in this, some much more than others. Call them, talk to them, phone them. They too would be very happy to hear from you and to try to answer any questions or concerns you might have. So I really want to emphasize that. And by the way, we had a subcommittee of executive and ministerial working on this project, and that subcommittee has done a tremendous amount of work in pulling all this together in terms of vetting all the input we received and making revisions to the documents. And so they are very knowledgeable about this, as well as other leaders, of course. They too are also very knowledgeable. Church Council has been involved, and we met this past week to vote on this and get it approved to go forward to you. And we also have executive and ministerial who have been very involved in this as well. The subcommittee, by the way, consisted of John, Pastor John, Leona Dick, Ian Jarvie, and myself. And as I say, please feel free to touch bases with them, call them, email them, whatever, and they can try to answer questions, or I can. So yeah, please reach out to us if you wish. We would encourage that. So on September 13th and 20th, we're going to have talk about 2 proposals to be voted on in November. That is the formation of a society and the adoption of a new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. On September 13th and 20th, we also want to deal with two other matters. And these are to do with Freedom Mobile and Genuine Learning Academy, the school that operates out of our church building here. Just let me tell you a little bit about Freedom Mobile. We have a contract with them, and they've installed a cell antenna on top of our building, and the revenues commenced in March. And a couple of years back, when we talked about Freedom Mobile, the congregation approved use of those monies for specific ministries or activities. That was the actual wording that was used. And so on the 13th and 20th of September, we want to make a proposal that the monies from March 2020 onward go to a designated reserve account to be utilized for specific ministries or activities, to be determined by the congregation sometime in the future. Okay, so we'd like to bring that motion forward for your consideration. So the motion is that the Freedom Mobile monies from March 2020 onward go to a designated reserve account to be utilized for specific ministries or activities to be determined by the congregation sometime in the future. So give that some thought, and we'll talk more about that on September 13th and 20th. With regards to Genuine Learning Academy, or GLA, as we call them, we have been in discussions with them this summer about renewing their lease. The lease expires September 1st, 2020, and we'd like to renew that lease with them. And but we have told them that we would need to get ratification by our leadership and by our congregation of the new lease for the school year to commence September 2020. We're hoping that they will be with us in September of 2020, and they plan to be with us. So we need to talk about renewing the lease. Under the new lease, the terms and conditions would be much the same as in the old lease. They anticipate about 10 students again this year, and they would pay $1,800 per month for their use of our facilities. So the board will come with a recommendation to the congregation regarding the use of the net revenues, because out of that monthly lease revenue, we do have some costs of our own which we have to cover off under the terms of the lease. So it's not a clear $1,800 per month. So we will bring forward a recommendation to the congregation regarding the use of the money. So the motion will be on September 13th and 20th as follows: that executive, ministerial, brackets the board, be given the authority to renew the lease with GLA for the upcoming school year commencing September 2020 and subsequent years. So we would like the to have authorization to renew this lease year to year as time goes on, with the understanding that we will always provide the congregation with periodic reports around the lease contract and the operations of GLA. So we're going to ask then for approval to renew the lease with GLA for the upcoming school year commencing September 1, 2020. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up what we wanted to put on video here for you, and we're really excited about the work that's happened and what we're doing, and the proposals going forward for the future of our church. And so yeah, we will be bringing forward two proposals around the new structure and procedures. A, to form a society. B, to adopt a new constitution, bylaws, and guidelines. And we would very much like to hear from you, as I've said several times, and we thank you for the input. We've already received some from leadership and combined council. We had a very good discussion last week, and we look forward to further discussion with you, and we look forward to your involvement in this important project. So, thank you for your time.